morning, everybody. I had to actually reschedule this stream because something very last minute happened yesterday. But I think it's really important to address the history of Malcolm X, especially since in these recent years, I've seen Malcolm X used as a weapon against Black people. And not even his controversial history, not his criminal background, which in my opinion has been exaggerated to the point where it's not even exaggerated. It's just they've used it to slander him at this point. They've added all kinds of lies to his criminal background to make it seem like a worse person. But interestingly enough, people are using the fact that Malcolm X has a mixed race background as a way to separate him from the Black community. Something that if Malcolm X was alive today, and I think he'd be like 99, so he probably would have a whole lot of dementia, and he probably wouldn't really give a shit what was going on the internet. But if he were alive today, he would be horrified that people were trying to separate him from the Black community because he had a white grandfather. Now, most of these people have not read the Autobiography of Malcolm X. In fact, very few of them have watched the movie done by Spike Lee in 1992. Most of them are vaguely influenced by Malcolm's work because they don't know much about it. Most high schools don't have it. See, they focus a lot on MLK because Martin Luther King was far more palatable to liberals during the 1960s than Malcolm X. Malcolm X was more militant. Malcolm X was more assertive. Martin Luther King started to become a little bit more assertive before his assassination, but his nonviolence, passive approach was something that the liberals ate up, where Malcolm terrified people. They were terrified because they knew that he had power, that he would wield it, that he wasn't intimidated, not only in aggressive settings, but also he was very poised, in control in these interviews. If you ever watch any Malcolm X's interviews, they try to goad him through the entire interview. They want to, bring out this aggressive criminal. But 9 times out of 10, he relaxes even more. You see him smile a lot more because he sees what they're doing. They're trying to trigger him. Similar tactics that they do today, but back in those days, back in the 1960s, people were a little bit more on the nose with their racism. The Alex Haley Autobiography of Malcolm X was done in collaboration with Malcolm X, but he was assassinated. So the posthumous work was released 9 months after his death. A lot of people pushed back at Alex Haley's work because they feel as though it's not directly from Malcolm. Well, yeah, he's dead. He couldn't finish the work. We all know Malcolm was a great orator, talented writer. Most of this stuff was self-taught because, as you're going to learn today, Malcolm wasn't big into school. Most of this stuff he learned as an adult, which shows you how remarkable he was to teach himself while incarcerated more than most people, especially Black people at that time, knew from their traditional education systems. So they pushed back on Alex Haley's work because it didn't come directly from Malcolm. But I also smell a little bit of racism in there also. Because if you look back in the 1960s, the people who followed Malcolm, of course, Black people, and not a whole bunch of them, most of the Black people who were behind him were a part of the Nation of Islam. But Malcolm had a weird fan base of white liberals. They wrote about him all the time, wrote article after article. Most of the biographies that were done by about Malcolm X after his death were mostly done by white journalists. I mean, and it makes sense. I mean, he would have been like a viral celebrity to them. You have this, Black man, great speaker, charismatic, and he eventually is shot down by other Black people, it appears, It's something to write about for years to come. It was a story that they got a lot of traction out of for many years, well into the 1970s. But make sure you look at the people who actually wrote those biographies. Much like the Nat Turner biography, you got to look at the people who wrote them and think about what kind of agenda they had. So, in my opinion, Alex Haley's autobiography that he wrote with Malcolm has more weight than any other biography since and will ever have. Now, Alex Haley has a bit of a controversial past, and this isn't about Alex Haley per se, but I feel like that's going to be the number one pushback. Alex Haley wrote it, and they don't believe it came from Malcolm. It did, though. Matter of fact, as we listen to this audiobook, you're going to feel Malcolm's spirit all through it. In fact, the person they got to narrate this, very talented. He was able to capture Malcolm's diction better than Denzel Washington, in my opinion. But Denzel, he did an amazing job. There's definitely not a criticism of that. I think it's important for people to understand how Malcolm viewed race and viewed color. Because when people try to weaponize the fact that Malcolm X has a mixed race background, as if that's something that he wanted or that was something that he was so proud of, it's kind of sick. Like, it was a matter of fact. Yes, he was a mixed race man, but he identified with blackness. That was where his allegiance was. That is the bottom line. So we're going to play some excerpts from the audiobook. I want you guys to actually check out the audiobook. It's available on YouTube. I feel like when audiobooks are available and you don't have to pay anything for them, we should take advantage of them. There's so much crap on YouTube. We can definitely pay attention to some positive things, right? So first things first, we're going to shut off this music. Well, his mother was a mulatto. His mother was from Grenada, if I'm not mistaken, and she was, a product of rape. And he talks about it in like pretty early on. But the interesting thing about Malcolm's mother, she had a lot of mental health issues. And there was a lot of abuse that happened in the house that the movie never talks about. The movie's a good movie, but they blah 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 through a lot of the backstory. And the backstory is very important because if you just watch the movie, you're going to think Malcolm X's father was a really good guy. He was kind of not. He was kind of an asshole. He was kind of a bad guy, and he was very abusive. And what you see is this abuse that he passes on to his wife. The wife, in turn, passes on to the children, and it becomes a cycle. And another thing you're going to notice about Malcolm's family is most of the men are killed before they're 50. Like 3 of his family members were murdered either by the Klan or the White League. So instead of me just explaining this story to you, I'm going to let Malcolm tell it to you. So hold on one second. I'm going to shut this music off and we're going to get into it. Hold on, I'm having some problems. 1 second. Can you guys hear that music? Okay, so I'm going to play it Please let me know if there's some audio issues because I'm having some weird computer problems, but we're gonna get through this. But to answer your question, if we're talking like culture, then no, I don't really think she knew much about her white side, she was a product of rape. But that doesn't really change the fact that she is what she is. And not only was she not monoracial, she also came from a different country. So she had a bit of an accent. So socially, when she came to America, and they're going to talk about that, she felt like an outcast. And I think that also contributed to some of her mental health issues.
The Autobiography of Malcolm X, as told to Alex Haley.
When my mother was pregnant with me, she told me later, a party of hooded Ku Klux Klan riders galloped up to our home in Omaha, Nebraska one night. Surrounding the house, brandishing their shotguns and rifles, they shouted for my father to come out. My mother went to the front door and opened it. Standing where they could see her pregnant condition, she told them that she was alone with 3 small children and that my father was away preaching in Milwaukee. The Klansmen shouted threats and warnings at her that we had better get out of town because the good Christian white people were not going to stand for my father spreading trouble among the good Negroes of Omaha with the back to Africa preachings of Marcus Garvey. My father, the Reverend Earl Little, was a Baptist minister, a dedicated organizer for Marcus Aurelius Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. With the help of such disciples as my father, Garvey, from his headquarters in New York City's Harlem, was raising the banner of black race purity and exhorting the Negro masses to return to their ancestral African homeland, a cause which had made Garvey the most controversial black man on earth. Still shouting threats, the Klansmen finally spurred their horses and galloped around the house, shattering every window pane with their gun butts. Then they rode off into the night, their torches flaring as suddenly as they had come. My father was enraged when he returned. He decided to wait until I was born, which would be soon, and then the family would move. I'm not sure why he made this decision, for he was not a frightened Negro, as most then were, and many still are today. My father was a big 6'4", very black man. He had only one eye. How he'd lost the other one eye, I've never known. He was from Reynolds, Georgia, where he had left school after the 3rd or maybe 4th grade. He believed, as did Marcus Garvey, that freedom, independence, and self-respect could never be achieved by the Negro in America, and that therefore the Negro should leave America to the white man and return to his African land of origin. Among the reasons my father had decided to risk and dedicate his life to help disseminate this philosophy among his people was that he had seen 4 of his 6 brothers die by violence, 3 of them killed by white men, including one by lynching. What my father could not know then was that of the remaining 3, including himself, only one, my Uncle Jim, would die in bed of natural causes. Northern white police were later to shoot my Uncle Oscar, and my father was himself to die by the white man's hands.
Do you guys believe in like a family curse? Because it makes me wonder about this specific family, especially when you look at the family tree. On both sides, there's either mental illness or tragic death. So I'm a person who believes in family curses. And I suspect that some of that could have played a factor in Malcolm's family.
It has always been my belief that I, too, will die by violence. I have done all that I can to be prepared. I was my father's 7th child. He had 3 children by a previous marriage, Ella, Earl, and Mary, who lived in Boston. He had met and married my mother in Philadelphia, where their first child, my oldest full brother, Wilfred, was born. They moved from Philadelphia to Omaha, where Hilda and then Philbert were born. I was next in line. My mother was 28 when I was born on May 19th, 1925, in an Omaha hospital. Then we moved to Milwaukee, where Reginald was born. From infancy, he had some kind of hernia condition which was to handicap him physically for the rest of his life. Louise Little, my mother, who was born in Grenada in the British West Indies, looked like a white woman. Her father was white. She had straight black hair, and her accent did not sound like a Negro's. Of this white father of hers, I know nothing except her shame about it. I remember hearing her say she was glad that she had never seen him. It was, of course, because of him that I got my reddish-brown, marinic color of skin and my hair of the same color. I was the lightest child in our family. Out in the world later on in Boston and New York, I was among the millions of Negroes who were insane enough to feel that it was some kind of status symbol to be light-complexioned, that one was actually fortunate to be born thus. But still later, I learned to hate every drop of that white rapist's blood that is in me.
I think Malcolm, we got to bear in mind, Malcolm was born in 1925. The time period that he grew up in was the middle of the Jim Crow era. So the idea of mixed race couples were very controversial, even in the Northeast. So any mixed race ancestry is usually either done due to rape, some type of secret liaison, sometimes prostitution. It was never done like a normal traditional relationship. So a lot of people who were mixed race during that time period had a lot of shame. Many of them who had white fathers would say that, oh, no, I'm part Native American or something like that, to kind of distance themselves from whiteness. So what Malcolm is talking about is a specific time period, how many people who will be considered mulattoes handled their mixed race experience. If they couldn't pass, and even if those who could pass, they would still distance themselves from whiteness.
Our family stayed only briefly in Milwaukee, for my father wanted to find a place where he could raise our own food and perhaps build a business. The teaching of Marcus Garvey stressed becoming independent of the white man. We went next, for some reason, to Lansing, Michigan. My father bought a house, and soon, as had been his pattern, he was doing freelance Christian preaching in the local Negro Baptist churches, and during the week he was roaming about spreading the word of Marcus Garvey. This time, the get-out-of-town threats came from a local hate society called the Black Legion. They wore black robes instead of white. Soon, nearly everywhere my father went, Black Legionnaires were reviling him as an uppity nigger for wanting to own a store, for living outside the Lansing Negro District, for spreading unrest and dissension among the good niggers.
A lot of times when people think of segregation, they always think of the South, but there was de facto segregation up north, even in raggedy ass towns like Lansing. Well, Lansing isn't raggedy, but the point I'm trying to make is that that type of segregation was very prominent up north. And I feel as though Hollywood has created this myth that the North was just this bastion of freedom and everybody came up north and they were treated with respect. I mean, clearly not. So it's interesting that that Malcolm brought up the parallels between the Klan and the Black Legion. They're basically the same thing. And when you look at the state of Michigan, there are lots of militias that look a lot like the Black Legion. So Michigan is a very interesting state with a very tattered relationship between the races.
As in Omaha, my mother was pregnant again, this time with my youngest sister. Shortly after Yvonne was born came the Nightmare Night in 1929, my earliest vivid memory. I remember being suddenly snatched awake into a frightening confusion of pistol shots and shouting and smoke and flames. My father had shouted and shot at the two white men who had set the fire and were running away. Our home was burning down around us. We were lunging and bumping and tumbling all over each other trying to escape. My mother, with the baby in her arms, just made it into the yard before the house crashed in, showering sparks. I remember we were outside in the night in our underwear, crying and yelling our heads off. The white police and firemen came and stood around watching as the house burned down to the ground. My father prevailed on some of his friends to clothe and house us temporarily. Then he moved us into another house on the outskirts of East Lansing. In those days, Negroes weren't allowed after dark in East Lansing proper. There's where Michigan State University is located. I related all.
I first read this book when I was 15, and that's when I learned that Lansing was a sundown town. I lived in Michigan most of my childhood, so to learn that about my state was crazy. That was the first time that I started to realize, segregation was really everywhere. They just hid it a lot better.
All this to an audience of students when I spoke there in January.
Oh yeah, Michigan is very much the Midwest. And Michigan State is a very good school. Very good school. Like I said, I didn't learn the fact that Lansing was a sundown town because when you go there, it seems so progressive. It has a major university there. Lots of young, yuppie people live there. But bear in mind, when I visited Michigan State, this was back in the mid 2000s. So must look like a completely different Lansing, 60, 70 years ago.
I remember we were outside in the night in our underwear, crying and yelling our heads off. The white police and firemen came and stood around watching as the house burned down to the ground. My father prevailed on some of his friends to clothe and house us temporarily. Then he moved us into another house on the outskirts of East Lansing. In those days, Negroes weren't allowed after dark in East Lansing proper. There's where Michigan State University is located. I related all this to an audience of students when I spoke there in January 1963. I told them how East Lansing harassed us so much that we had to move again, this time 2 miles out of town into the country. This is where my father built for us with his own hands a 4-room house. This is where I really began to remember things, this home where I started to grow up. After the fire, I remember that my father was called in and questioned about a permit for the pistol with which he had shot at the white man who set the fire. I remember the police were always dropping by our house, shoving things around, just checking or looking for a gun. The pistol they were looking for, which they never found, and for which they wouldn't issue a permit, was sewed up inside a pillow. My father's .22 rifle and his shotgun, though, were right out in the open. Everyone had them for hunting birds and rabbits and other game. After that, my memories are of the friction between my father and mother. They seemed to be nearly always at odds. Sometimes my father would beat her. It might have had something to do with the fact that my mother had a pretty good education. Where she got it, I don't know, but an educated woman, I suppose, can't resist the temptation to correct an uneducated man. Every now and then, when she would put those smooth words on him, he would grab her. My father was also belligerent toward all of the children, except me.
It makes me wonder, what exactly were the smooth words? It seems like any type of resistance from women during that time period will result in some type of domestic violence. And it just goes, the description of his father, it just so conflicting. In one part, he's an activist, a man who is a pastor of some sort, but he can't use his words when he's talking with his wife, who's, happens to have some type of traditional education. I don't know. I feel like there's some other elements that, of course, we're never going to know, but it just goes to show you there was a lot of chaos in his household. So it's no surprise, Malcolm as a young man ended in a life of crime.
The older ones he would beat almost savagely if they broke any of his rules, and he had so many rules it was hard to know them all. Nearly all my whippings came from my mother. I actually believe that as anti-white as my father was, he was subconsciously so afflicted with the white man's brainwashing of Negroes that he inclined to favor the light ones, and I was his lightest child. Back when I was growing up, the successful Lansing Negroes were such as waiters and bootblacks. To be a janitor at some downtown store was to be highly respected. The real elite, the big shots, the voices of the race, were the waiters at the Lansing Country Club and the shoeshine boys at the state capitol. The only Negroes who had any money were the ones in the numbers racket, or who ran gambling houses, or who in some other way lived parasitically off the poorest ones, who were the masses. No Negroes were hired then by Lansing's big Oldsmobile plant or the Rio plant. The bulk of the Negroes were either on welfare or WPA, or they starved. The day was to come when our family was so poor that we would eat the whole out of a donut. But at that time, we were much better off than most town Negroes. The reason was we raised much of our own food out there in the country where we were. We were much better off than the town Negroes who would shout as my father preached for the pie in the sky and the heaven in the hereafter while the white man had his here on earth. I knew that the collections my father got from his preaching were mainly what fed and clothed us, and he also did other odd jobs, but still, the image of him that made me proudest was his crusading and militant campaigning with the word of Marcus Garvey. As young as I was then, I knew from what I overheard that my father was saying something that made him a tough man. I remember an old lady grinning and saying to my father, "You're scaring these white folks to death." One of the reasons I've always felt that my father favored me was that, to the best of my remembrance, it was only me that he sometimes took with him to the Garvey UNIA meetings, which he held quietly in different people's homes. There never were more than a few people at any one time, 20 at most. But that was a lot packed into someone's living room. I noticed how differently they all acted, although sometimes they were the same people who jumped and shouted in church. But in these meetings, both they and my father were more intense, more intelligent, and down to earth. It made me feel the same way. I can remember hearing of Adam driven out of the garden into the caves of Europe, Africa for the Africans, Ethiopians awake. And my father would talk about how it would not be much longer before Africa would be completely run by Negroes. By black men was the phrase he always used. No one knows when the hour of Africa's redemption cometh. It is in the wind. It is coming one day. Like a storm, it will be here. I have never understood why, after hearing as much as I did of these kinds of things, I somehow never thought then of the black people in Africa. My image of Africa at the time was of naked savages, cannibals, monkeys, and tigers and steaming jungles. My mother at this time seemed to be always working, cooking, washing, ironing, cleaning, and fussing over us 8 children. And she was usually either arguing with or not speaking to my father. One cause of friction was that she had strong ideas about what she wouldn't eat and didn't want us to eat, including pork and rabbit, both of which my father loved dearly. He was a real Georgia Negro, and he believed in eating plenty of what we in Harlem today call soul food. I've said that my mother was the one who whipped me. At least she did whenever she wasn't ashamed to let the neighbors think that she was killing me. For if she even acted as though she was about to raise her hand to me, I would open my mouth and let the world know about it. If anybody was passing by out on the road, she would either change her mind or just give me a few licks. Thinking about it now, I feel definitely that just as my father favored me for being lighter than the other children, my mother gave me more hell for the same reason. She was very light herself, but she favored the ones who were darker. Wilfred, I know, was particularly her angel. I remember that she would tell me to get out of the house and let the sun shine on you so you can get some color. She went out of her way never to let me become afflicted with a sense of color superiority.
You know what? Especially when I listened to this over again, like I want to say maybe like 2 months ago, I listened to the entire book all over again. And I really feel like his mother did not like looking at herself through Malcolm. Like the fact that he looked so much like her, his skin was light, he had light color eyes. It was too much of a reflection of herself, and it just freaked her out. And she already had mental health issues and an abusive husband. So like this is just a fertile ground for like children who are going to ultimately be taken away by the system. And of course, had Malcolm's father not been murdered, maybe the family structure would have stayed together, but there was a lot of instability within that family. But yeah, I can see her targeting him. And he's probably going easy on his mother, but she probably abused him a lot. And that's probably why he was screaming and crying all the time, because she was always targeting him. But yeah, I get the impression he's going easy on her, because bear in mind, his mother is still alive now. When he was working on this book, she was maybe in her, late mid 60s, maybe a little bit younger than that, actually. And she was very mentally vulnerable. I think she was still inpatient, or maybe she was living with a family member at that point. So he was clearly not trying to point out all her flaws, but I honestly believe that she targeted him a lot for physical abuse.
I'm sure that she treated me this way partly because of how she came to be light herself. I learned early that crying out in protest could accomplish things. My older brothers and sister had started to school when sometimes they would come in and ask for a buttered biscuit or something, and my mother, impatiently, would tell them no. But I would cry out and make a fuss until I got what I wanted. I remember well how my mother asked me why I couldn't be a nice boy like Wilfred, but I would think to myself that Wilfred, for being so nice and quiet, often stayed hungry. So early in life, I had learned that if you want something, you better make some noise. Not only did we have our big garden, but we raised chickens. My father would buy some baby chicks, and my mother would raise them. We all loved chicken. That was one dish there was no argument with my father about. One thing in particular that I remember made me feel grateful toward my mother was that one day I went and asked her for my own garden, and she did let me have my own little plot. I loved it and took care of it well. I loved especially to grow peas. I was proud when we had them on our table. I would pull out the grass in my garden by hand when the first little blades came up. I would patrol the rows on my hands and knees for any worms and bugs, and I would kill and bury them. And sometimes when I had everything straight and clean for my things to grow, I would lie down on my back between two rows. I would gaze up in the blue sky at the clouds moving and think of all kinds of things. At 5, I too began to go to school, leaving home in the morning along with Wilfred, Hilda, and Filbert. It was the Pleasant Grove school that went from kindergarten through the 8th grade. It was 2 miles outside the city limits, and I guess there was no problem about our attending because we were the only Negroes in the area. In those days, white people in the North usually would adopt just a few Negroes. They didn't see them as any threat. The white kids didn't make any great thing about us either. They called us nigger and darky and rastus so much that we thought those were our natural names. But they didn't think of it as an insult. It was just the way they thought about us. One afternoon in 1931, when Wilfred, Hilda, Filbert, and I came home, my mother and father were having one of their arguments. There had lately been a lot of tension around the house because of Black Legion threats. Anyway, my father had taken one of the rabbits which we were raising and ordered my mother to cook it. We raised rabbits but sold them to whites. My father had taken a rabbit from the rabbit pen. He had pulled off the rabbit's head. He was so strong, he needed no knife to behead chicken or rabbits. With one twist of his big black hands, he simply twisted off the head and threw the bleeding neck thing back at my mother's feet.
Yeah. Do you want your husband doing that? Like, I don't want to hear anything about, oh, it was a different time period. No, that's some traumatic shit. And as I put in the chat, the system of oppression doesn't just affect people person by person, but it also rolls over right into the family system. So because the kids are oppressed at school, the parents are oppressed everywhere they go, and it just bleeds over into chaos in the household. Because what the hell? A small like resistance to not wanting to cook rabbits, and his solution is ripping its head off and throwing it at his wife. I mean, yeah, he doesn't look good in this audio book or any other book. Like, you know, I've heard people try to, I don't know, try to repair his image in other books that I've read about Malcolm, but this guy didn't seem like a really good guy.
My mother was crying. She started to skin the rabbit preparatory to cooking it. But my father was so angry he slammed on out of the front door and started walking up the road toward town. It was then that my mother had this vision. She had always been a strange woman in this sense and had always had a strong intuition of things about to happen. And most of her children are the same way, I think. When something is about to happen, I can feel something, sense something. I never have known something to happen that has caught me completely off guard, except once. And that was when years later I discovered facts I couldn't believe about a man who, up until that discovery, I would gladly have given my life for. My father was well up the road when my mother ran screaming out onto the porch. "Early, early!" She screamed his name. She clutched her apron up in one hand and ran down across the yard and into the road. My father turned around. He saw her. For some reason, considering how angry he had been when he left, he waved at her. But he kept on going. She told me later, my mother did, that she had a vision of my father's end. All of the rest of the afternoon she was not herself, crying and nervous and upset. She finished cooking the rabbit and put the whole thing in the warmer part of the black stove. When my father was not back home by our bedtime, my mother hugged and clutched us, and we felt strange, not knowing what to do because she had never acted like that. I remember waking up to the sound of my mother screaming again. When I scrambled out, I saw the police in the living room. They were trying to calm her down. She had snatched on her clothes to go with them, and all of us children who were staring knew without anyone having to say it that something terrible had happened to our father. My mother was taken by the police to the hospital and to a room where a sheet was over my father in a bed, and she wouldn't look. She was afraid to look. Probably it was wise that she didn't. My father's skull on one side was crushed in, I was told later. Negroes in Lansing have always whispered that he was attacked and then laid across some tracks for a streetcar to run him over. His body was cut almost in half. He lived 2.5 hours in that condition. Negroes then were stronger than they are now, especially Georgia Negroes. Negroes born in Georgia had to be strong simply to survive. It was morning when we children at home got the word that he was dead. I was 6. I can remember a vague commotion, the house filled up with people crying, saying bitterly that the White-Black Legion had finally got him.
So if you watch the movie, there's no ambiguity. They definitely blame the Black Legion for the death of Malcolm's father. However, there's also no context of his mental health issues, the familial discord, the domestic abuse. There's no context of any of that in the movie, so you don't know that it exists. Knowing what we know, is there a possibility that he could have killed himself? I'm not saying that he did, but I wouldn't be surprised based off of what happened just moments earlier. Of course, he was already having issues within the community, the white people targeting them, so there's definitely that. That's more than likely what happened. But I guess there's also a possibility that he did take his own life because he was clearly not in a good space mentally. And a lot of times people take their life at that moment.
My mother was hysterical. In the bedroom, women were holding smelling salts under her nose. She was still hysterical at the funeral. I don't have a very clear memory of the funeral either. Oddly, the main thing I remember about it was that it wasn't in a church, and that surprised me, since my father was a preacher, and I had been there when he preached people's funerals in churches. But his was in a funeral home. And I remember that during the service, a big black fly came down and landed on my father's face, and Wilfred sprang up from his chair and he shooed the fly away, and he came groping back to his chair. There were folding chairs for us to sit on, and the tears were streaming down his face. When we went by the casket, I remember that I thought it looked as if my father's strong black face had been dusted with flour, and I wished they hadn't put on such a lot of it.
The family that Earl Little left behind faced many hardships. When a life insurance policy he had carried refused to pay, claiming the death was a suicide, the family sank quickly into debt and then onto welfare. Louise Little worked whatever jobs she could find, mostly housework and sewing for white families, and Wilfred, the oldest child, quit school and went to work. But there was never enough money, and by 1934, at the height of the Depression, the family was desperate. Growing fast, always hungry, Malcolm would sometimes steal food from stores in Lansing. He also began visiting friends and neighbors around dinner time, particularly a family named Gohannes, who were raising a nephew called Big Boy of Malcolm's age. When Malcolm was caught stealing, he became the focus of efforts by state agencies to place Louise Little's children in foster homes. Malcolm's mother made no secret of the hatred she felt for the welfare workers. She deeply resented their frequent visits and became incensed when she discovered that they had already made initial arrangements for Malcolm to live with the Gohannes. The welfare workers began to suggest to the children that their mother might be losing her mind.
It was about this time that a large, dark man from Lansing began visiting. I don't remember how or where he and my mother met. It may have been through some mutual friends. I don't remember what his profession was. In 1935 in Lansing, Negroes didn't have anything you could call a profession. But the man, big and black, looked something like my father. I can remember his name, but there's no need to mention it. He was a single man, and my mother was a widow, only 36 years old. The man was independent. Naturally, she admired that. She was having a hard time disciplining us, and a big man's presence alone would help. And if she had a man to provide, it would send the state people away forever. We all understood without ever saying much about it, or at least we had no objection. We took it in stride, even with some amusement among us, that when the man came, our mother would be all dressed up in the best that she had. She was still a good-looking woman, and she would act differently, lighthearted and laughing, as we hadn't seen her act in years. It went on for about a year, I guess, and then about 1936 and 1937, the man from Lansing jilted my mother suddenly. He just stopped coming to see her. From what I later understood, he finally backed away from taking on the responsibility of those 8 mouths to feed. He was afraid of so many of us. To this day, I can see the trap that mother was in, saddled with all of us. I can also understand why he would shun taking on such a tremendous responsibility. But it was a terrible shock to her. It was the beginning of the end of reality for my mother. When she began to sit around and walk around talking to herself, almost as though she was unaware that we were there, it became increasingly terrifying. The state people saw her weakening. That was when they began the definite steps to take me away from home. They began to tell me how nice it was going to be at the Gohannes home, where the Gohannes had all said how much they liked me and would like to have me live with them. I liked all of them too, but I didn't want to leave Wilfred. I looked up to and admired my big brother. I didn't want to leave Hilda, who was like my second mother, or Filbert. Even in our fighting, there was a feeling of brotherly union. Or Reginald especially, who was weak with his hernia condition and who looked up to me as his big brother who looked out for him as I looked up to Wilfred. And I had nothing either against the babies, Yvonne, Wesley, and Robert. As my mother talked to herself more and more, she gradually became less responsive to us and less responsible.
So, though we can criticize the welfare system and the social services people, they kind of had a point. There were 8 kids there. The mother did not have a job to really take care of all these kids. She was clearly losing her mind to the point where it was so obvious she was neglecting her kids. Now, of course, they're not paying attention to the system that claimed the life of her husband and the big FU that the insurance system did to them. They don't care about any of that. There was no type of structure or system that can help those people. And guess what? There still isn't today. The same thing that happened to Louise Little can happen to you today. Insurance companies oftentimes don't pay for policies. Anybody who's had to bury a loved one may have had an experience like that where they thought they had coverage, but they really didn't have coverage. And now you have to grieve and figure this stuff out all at the same time. And this was a young woman. She had 8 kids. So, like, most of her adult life was with this same man. And now she's by herself and she doesn't know what to do. And you can't go to the system and get much help. Little welfare they were given back in the day was peanuts. It's still peanuts today. I don't know why people think the welfare is really just paying people, like people are just rolling in dough because of welfare. But it was really peanuts back in the day. Who could she go to? She's not from America. She has no family here. She's literally by herself.
The house became less tidy. We began to be more unkempt. And usually now, Hilda cooked. We children watched our anchor giving way. It was something terrible that you couldn't get your hands on, yet you couldn't get away from. It was a sensing that something bad was going to happen. We younger ones leaned more and more heavily on the relative strength of Wilfred and Hilda, who were the oldest. When finally I was sent to the Gohannes house, at least in a surface way, I was glad. I remember that when I left home with the state man, my mother said one thing: don't let them feed him any pig. It was better in a lot of ways at the Gohannes. Big boy and I shared his room together, and we hit it off nicely. He just wasn't the same as my blood brothers. The Gohannes were very religious people. Big boy and I attended church with them. They were sanctified holy rollers now. The preachers and congregations jumped even high and shouted even louder than the Baptists I had known. They sang at the top of their lungs and swayed back and forth and cried and moaned and beat on tambourines and chanted. It was spooky, with ghosts and spirituals and haint seeming to be in the very atmosphere when finally we all came out of the church going back home. Mr. Gohannes was close cronies with some of the other men who, some Saturdays, would take me and Big Boy with them hunting rabbits. I had my father's .22 caliber rifle. My mother had said it was all right for me to take it with me. The old men had a set rabbit hunting strategy that they had always used. Usually when a dog jumps a rabbit and the rabbit gets away, the rabbit will always somehow instinctively run in a circle and return sooner or later past the very spot where he originally was jumped. Well, the old men would just sit and wait somewhere for the rabbit to come back, then get their shots at him. I got to thinking about it. And finally, I thought of a plan. I would separate from them and Big Boy, and I would go to a point where I figured that the rabbit returning would have to pass me first. It worked like magic. I began to get 3 and 4 rabbits before they got 1. The astonishing thing was that none of the old men ever figured out why. They outdid themselves, exclaiming what a sure shot I was. I was about 12 then. All I had done was to improve on their strategy, and it was the beginning of a very important lesson in life. that any time you find someone more successful than you are, especially when you're both engaged in the same business, you know they're doing something that you aren't. Eventually, my mother suffered a complete breakdown, and the court orders were finally signed. They took her to the state mental hospital at Kalamazoo. It was 70-some miles from Lansing, about an hour and a half on the bus. A Judge McClellan in Lansing had authority over me and all my brothers and sisters. We were state children, court wards. He had the full say-so over us, a white man in charge of a black man's children. Nothing but legal modern slavery, however kindly intentioned. My mother remained in the same hospital at Kalamazoo for about 26 years. Later, when I was still growing up in Michigan, I would go to visit her every so often. Nothing that I can imagine could have moved me so deeply as seeing her pitiful state. In 1963, we got my mother out of the hospital, and she now lives there in Lansing with Filbert and his family. It was so much worse than if it had been a physical sickness, for which a cause might have been known, medicine given, a cure effected. Every time I visited her, when finally they led her, a case, a number, back inside from where we had been sitting together, I felt worse. My last visit, when I knew I would never come to see her again, there, was in 1952. I was 27. My brother Filbert had told me that on his last visit she had recognized him somewhat, in spots, he said. But she didn't recognize me at all. She stared at me. She didn't know who I was. Her mind, when I tried to talk to reach her, was somewhere else. I asked, "Mama, do you know what day it is?" She said, staring, "All the people have gone." I can't describe how I felt. The woman who had brought me into the world and nursed me and advised me and chastised me and loved me didn't know me. It was as if I was trying to walk up the side of a hill of feathers. I looked at her. I listened to her talk. But there was nothing I could do. I truly believe that if ever a state social agency destroyed a family, it destroyed ours. We wanted and tried to stay together. Our home didn't have to be destroyed, but the welfare, the courts, and the doctor gave us the 1, 2, 3 punch, and ours was not the only case of this kind. I knew I wouldn't be back to see my mother again because it could make me a very vicious and dangerous person. Knowing how they had looked at us as numbers and as a case in their book, not as human beings. And knowing that my mother in there was a statistic that didn't have to be, that existed because of a society's failure, hypocrisy, greed, and lack of mercy and compassion. Hence,
And some people would say that's still the case with the social services system. Now, I don't work in that side of the system, but I can tell you that unfortunately people are still viewed as just a case and a number.
I have no mercy or compassion in me for a society that will crush people and then penalize them for not being able to stand up under the weight. I have rarely talked to anyone about my mother, for I believe that I am capable of killing a person without hesitation who happened to make the wrong kind of remark about my mother. So I purposely don't make any opening for some fool to step into. Back when our family was destroyed in 1937, Wilfred and Hilda were old enough so that the state let them stay on their own in the big 4-room house that my father had built. Filbert was placed with another family in Lansing, a Mrs. Hackett, while Reginald and Wesley went to live with a family called Williams, who were friends of my mother's. And Yvonne and Robert went to live with a West Indian family named McGuire. Separated though we were, all of us maintained fairly close touch around Lansing, in school and out, whenever we could get together. Despite the artificially created separation and distance between us, we still remain very close in our feelings toward each other. Not long after this, I came into a classroom with my hat on. I did it deliberately. The teacher, who was white, ordered me to keep the hat on and to walk around and around the room until he told me to stop. That way, he said, everyone can see you. Meanwhile, we'll go on with the class for those who are here to learn something. I was still walking around when he got up from his desk and turned to the blackboard to write something on it. Everyone in the classroom was looking when at this moment I passed behind his desk, snatched up a thumbtack, and deposited it in his chair. When he turned to sit back down, I was far from the scene of the crime, circling around the rear of the room. Then he hit the tack and I heard him holler and caught a glimpse of him spraddling up as I disappeared through the door. With my deportment record, I wasn't really shocked when the decision came that I had been expelled. I guess I must have had some vague idea that if I didn't have to go to school, I'd be allowed to stay on with the Gohannas and wander around town or maybe get a job if I wanted one for pocket money. But I got rocked on my heels when a state man whom I hadn't seen before came and got me at the Gohannas and took me down to court. They told me I was going to reform school. I was still 13 years old.
Malcolm was sent to live in a detention home in Mason, a small town about 12 miles from Lansing. There he became, as he called it, the mascot of the couple who ran the home, a Mr. and Mrs. Swirlin. The Swirlins were clearly impressed with Malcolm's intelligence. They gave him small jobs to do around their house and eventually got him a job washing dishes in a local restaurant. But they often spoke disparagingly of niggers in front of him, as if he weren't there. The same way, Malcolm X wrote, people would talk freely in front of a pet canary. Instead of reform school, Malcolm became the first ward of the detention home ever to be placed in Mason Junior High School, where he was a top student and was even elected president of his 7th grade class, and where his history teacher was particularly fond of telling nigger jokes in Malcolm's presence. When Malcolm told his English teacher, whom he had regarded as a friend and advisor, that he'd like to be a lawyer one day, the instructor told him, "That's no realistic goal for a nigger. You're good with your hands. Why don't you plan on carpentry?" After this incident, Malcolm became increasingly withdrawn, especially from white people. He also began to get restless. During the summer of his 14th year, he visited his half-sister, Ella, in Boston. A commanding woman, he wrote of her. The way she sat, moved, talked, did everything, bespoke somebody who did and got exactly what she wanted. Ella had come north from Georgia with nothing, and she had worked hard and invested her savings in property. I had never been so impressed with anybody, Malcolm noted, and he was equally impressed with the excitement of life in the big city. When he finished 8th grade at Mason Junior High, he left Michigan and moved into Ella's house in the Wambeck and Humboldt Avenue Hill section of Roxbury, Boston's largest black neighborhood. The Hill, as it was known, was considered an exclusive area where many black professionals lived: teachers, preachers, Pullman porters, bank janitors, and other members of the black community's elite. Ella told Malcolm to enjoy himself, to get to know the neighborhood, and when the time was right, she'd help him find a job. But Malcolm was not attracted to the status of the Hill. He was drawn to the nightlife, to the jazz and the lights, and he began to roam, late and wide, through the streets of Boston.
I spent my first month in town with my mouth hanging open. The sharp-dressed young cats who hung on the corners and in the pool rooms, bars, and restaurants, and who obviously didn't work anywhere, completely entranced me. I couldn't get over marveling how their hair was straight and shiny like white men's hair. Ella told me this was called a conch. I had never tasted a sip of liquor, never even smoked a cigarette, and here I saw little black children, 10 and 12 years old, shooting craps, playing cards, fighting, getting grown-ups to put a penny or a nickel on their number for them, things like that. And these children threw around swear words I had never even heard before even, and slang expressions that were just as new to me, such as stud and cat, chick and cool and hip. Every night as I lay in bed, I turned these new words over in my mind. It was shocking to me that in town, especially after dark, you'd occasionally see a white girl and a Negro man strolling arm in arm along the sidewalk, and mixed couples drinking in the neon-lighted bars, not slipping off to some dark corner, as in Lansing. I wanted to find a job myself to surprise Ella. One afternoon, something told me to go inside a pool room whose window I was looking through. I had looked through that window many times. I wasn't yearning to play pool. In fact, I had never held a cue stick. But I was drawn by the sight of the cool-looking cat standing around inside, bending over the big green felt-top tables, making bets and shooting the bright-colored balls into the holes. As I stared through the window this particular afternoon, something made me decide to venture inside and talk to a dark, stubby, conch-headed fellow who racked up balls for the pool players, whom I'd heard called Shorty. One day, he had come outside and seen me standing there, and he said, "Hi, Red." So that made me figure he was friendly. As inconspicuously as I could, I slipped inside the door and around the side of the pool room, avoiding people, and on to the back where Shorty was filling an aluminum can with powder that pool players dust on their hands. He looked up at me. Later on, Shorty would enjoy teasing me about how, with that first glance, he knew my whole story. "Man, that cat still smelled country," he'd say, laughing. "Cat's legs were so long, his pants so short, his knees showed, and his head looked like a briar patch." But that afternoon, Shorty didn't let it show in his face how country I'd appeared when I told him I'd appreciate it if he'd tell me how could somebody go about getting a job like his. "If you mean racking up balls," said Shorty, "I don't know of no pool joints around here needing anybody." "You mean you just want any slave you can find?" A slave meant work, a job. He asked me what kind of work I had done. I told him that I'd washed restaurant dishes in Mason, Michigan. He nearly dropped that powder can. "My homeboy, man, give me some skin. I'm from Lansing." I never told Shorty, and he never suspected that he was about 10 years older than I. He took us to be about the same age. First, I would have been embarrassed to tell him. Later, I just never bothered. Shorty had dropped out of first-year high school in Lansing, lived a while with an uncle and aunt in Detroit, and had spent the last 6 years living with his cousin in Roxbury. But when I mentioned the names of Lansing people and places, he remembered many, and pretty soon we sounded as if we had been raised in the same block. I could sense Shorty's genuine gladness, and I don't have to say how lucky I felt to find a friend as hip as he obviously was. "Man, this is a swinging town if you dig it," Shorty said. "You're my homeboy. I'm going to school you to the happenings." I stood there and grinned like a fool. "You got to go anywhere now?" "Well, stick around till I get off." One thing I liked immediately about Shorty was his frankness. When I told him where I lived, he said what I already knew, that nobody in town could stand the Hill Negroes. But he thought a sister who gave me a pad, not charging me rent, not even running me out to find some slave, couldn't be all bad. Shorty's slave in the pool room, he said, was just to keep ends together while he learned his horn. A couple of years before, he'd hit the numbers and bought a saxophone. "Got it right here in the closet now for my lesson tonight." Shorty was taking lessons with some other studs, and he intended one day to organize his own small band. "There's a lot of bread to be made gigging right around here in Roxbury," Shorty explained to me. "I don't dig joining some big band one night and all over just to say I played with Count or Duke or somebody." I thought that was smart. I wished I had studied a horn, but I'd never been exposed to one. Through the afternoon, Shorty introduced me to players and loungers. "My homeboy," he'd say. "He's looking for a slave if you hear anything." They all said they'd look out. At 7 o'clock, when the night ball racket came on, Shorty told me he had to hurry to a saxophone lesson. But before he left, he held out to me the $6 or $7 he had collected that day in nickel and dime tips. "You got enough bread, homeboy?" I was okay, I told him. I had $2. But Shorty made me take 3 more. "A little fattening for your pocket," he said. Before we went out, he opened his saxophone case and showed me the horn. It was gleaming brass against the green velvet, an alto sax. He said, "Keep cool, homeboy, and come back tomorrow. Some of the cats will turn you up a slave."
Malcolm's first big city job was shining shoes at the Roseland State Ballroom. Besides dancers and drunks, he shined the shoes of Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Cootie Williams, Lionel Hampton, and many other famous musicians who played the Roseland. He also learned his first hustles there, setting up white customers with black whores and selling liquor and reefers on the side. Shorty showed Malcolm the wonders of buying on credit. Malcolm bought his first zoot suit, and when his hair grew long enough, Shorty decided it was time for Malcolm's first conk.
I'm going to actually post the link to the entire audiobook in the description. I want you guys to check this out. But very important story, in my opinion, especially if you're going to talk about not only just mixed race people in America, because you got to look at the entire history, but also just the civil rights movement and how it all really started. It really started in the 1940s and 1950s, and it rolled into the 1960s. And it's interesting to see, you know, Malcolm's father technically was a part of a very militant Marcus Garvey group, and his son ultimately got affiliated with the Nation of Islam. I have my opinions about that organization, but he was one of the forefathers of the civil rights movement. Personally, I view him much higher than MLK. I have a lot of criticisms for MLK. I understand why he's important to the community. However, I feel like he was more akin to an industry plant than people would like to accept, but that's another conversation for a different stream. And I want to thank you guys for hanging out, but I have to get my ass to work. Talk to you guys later.